Robert Eggers has leapt onto the horror scene in a unique way, bringing elevated horror to a new level with period-accurate atmosphere, dialogue, visual storytelling elements, and most importantly, good old Americana and its darkest anxieties. His feature film debut The Witch was released as a catalyst for the slow burn horror genre. It received somewhat split criticism from audiences for its lack of jump scares, chase scenes, overwrought musical scoring, fast pacing, and formulaic kill styles. It used a film language all its own to create a genuinely terrifying atmosphere that paints a picture of puritanical regret, scarcity, and shame. Subsequent films such as Mother, Hereditary, and Midsommar have followed suit in using the slow burn, atmospheric, literary style of horror, much to critical avail. After The Witch defined what to expect from an Eggers film, 2019's The Lighthouse feels like it has solidified his style. If The Witch explores feminine horror, The Lighthouse is its masculine counterpart. I have long toiled over what exactly makes these films so effective, and what strikes me as most true about these films is their presentation of a status quo, an obstacle to that status quo, the horror that is created when those two things clash, and the tools the film uses to illustrate the horror. Each of these components is unique and specific to each of the respective films, and through breaking them down film by film, I hope to explain why I can't stop thinking about them. The Witch takes place in colonial New England around the 1630s. The unnamed family banished to the edge of the forest by their village struggles to get by, with little crops to speak of and not many resources otherwise. Puritans are huge believers of original sin, basically the idea that because of the sins of Adam and Eve, we are fundamentally flawed beings that must spend our time suffering and contributing hard work to care for the earth that God created. This root belief is very convenient for the environment in which they live. The land is not fertile, the labor is hard and gives very little reward, the climate is austere and unforgiving. Creating a theology around the anxiety of scarcity and shame is very convenient in keeping people productive, modest, and focused on prayer rather than their own mental well-being and needs. The obstacle to this status quo comes in the form of a teenage girl, Thomasin. She is old enough to be considered property by her parents, as they consider selling her off to another family to work as a housekeeper and caretaker. At the film's start, she is shown confessing her sins, doing everything she is meant to do. Through the course of the story, she navigates accusations being thrown in every direction, and her very existence through all of this is seen as an obstacle to the status quo. Not a single person in her life refrains from assuming she's made deals with the devil. This conflict between a girl desperately trying to hold on to her autonomy and a parental system that cannot accept their own inadequacy is what causes the horror to happen. Though the film focuses on the inner life of Thomasin primarily, we understand the perceived horror from both sides of the conflict. In Thomasin's eyes, the ultimate horror is a world in which she cannot be free. There is a building dread as we learn more about how each family member is perceived and challenged. The youngest, the unbaptized Samuel, was the only one born in the New World, and he's the first one to go missing and die. The family is horrified by the notion that he was damned to hell, a gruesome fate for a baby. The twins, as children were often perceived at the time, were pests, too old to be helpless but too young to be productive. They play incessantly with the goat Black Phillip, a whimsical and evidently harmless activity that ends up being the most damning of anyone in the family. Caleb, the eldest son, is damned by temptation. He is old enough to fit into the productive structure of the family, but naive enough to succumb to adolescent desire. Ultimately, he vomits up an apple, a symbol of temptation, after confessing his love for the Lord, a moment of desperation after succumbing to his desire. As we observe these elements unfold, we realize that Thomasin's greatest horror is feeling trapped, being the scapegoat of the family just through the very nature of being an autonomous teenage girl, the ultimate threat to a patriarchal structure. Since the parents cannot bring themselves to blame for their colonial regret, they must turn to the scapegoat. The film's cinematic language conveys the horror of this story in a masterful way, through emphasizing the feminine horror of the environment and atmosphere. In naturalistic lighting, no light other than sun and candles, Robert Eggers shows the constantly dreary, cold, damp world they exist in. There is an editing style akin to anti-jump scares, lingering on certain images and sound to develop, building dread. There is witch imagery in all its major forms in culture, from the naked, grubby form that grinds baby Samuel into a paste for her flying spell, to the sexy seductress form that tantalizes Caleb into following her to meet his hormonally tortured demise, to, most terrifyingly, Thomasin herself. She performs no magic, does no shape-shifting, only acts out in violence through self-defense, and appears merely as a nondescript teenage girl of the times. Yet, due to her need for autonomy, is deemed a witch nonetheless. It is only after she had escaped the grips of her parents, unfortunately through their death, that she meets the devil via a shape-shifting, whispery Black Phillip, and accepts her truth in the coven as a witch.
What dost thou want?
What canst thou give?
Wouldst thou like the taste of butter? A pretty dress? Wouldst thou like to live deliciously?
Yes.
Visually, this is depicted by a single, simple supernatural event. Thomasin rising with her coven in the forest, amongst the trees, away from her responsibility, smiling and reveling in her The naturalism Eggers displays creates an airtight space in which the psychological horror of scarcity and shame in The Witch are indisputable. The primary cause of a lot of the tension of the story is the Father William's inadequacy. However, the horrors depicted in The Witch are explored through the feminine lens. The depiction of nude bodies in vulnerable situations, the imagery of a raven pecking the mother's chest, the grotesque destruction of a woman's most valued product to her family, a baby boy, a bloody apple, and other images all fit under the umbrella of imagery that is tied to femininity. In The Lighthouse, we learn about American horror through a completely different time period and regarding specifically masculine anxieties and horrors that come with said time period. The status quo of the world in The Lighthouse is seen through the character Willem Dafoe plays, which I will refer to as old throughout. I will refer to Rob Pattinson's character as young. Old is a wickie, a lighthouse attendant that has known this life for many, many years. He has sacrificed his relationship with his entire family for this work and prides himself on his identity as a wickie. He speaks like he just hopped out of a copy of Moby Dick, he farts a lot,
Goddamn farts! You goddamn farts!
he's crabby, demanding, and worst of all, he won't let Young go near the actual light of the lighthouse. Young has a mysterious past. He reveals that his name isn't what he initially says it is. he is a migrant worker and that he is looking to start anew with and learn to become a true wiki. He is initially confident in the guidebook and the structure of his work relationship with Old until he realizes how much of an obstacle Old is to his goal. Old sees Young as a threat to his own employment. How could some young idiot come along and do what he spent his whole life perfecting? There's a clear connection between the changing workforce of the rapidly industrializing 1890s and the changing workplaces that baby boomers and millennials have had to learn to occupy. The masculine tension of battling over identity is played out through a story filled with nautical imagery, drunken no-homo moments, allusions to ancient mythology, lots of farts, and some brutal Jungian and Freudian imagery. The Lighthouse is visually a much more brutal experience than The Witch. It is filmed at a 1.19:1 aspect ratio on film that has no red light filter, so every minute detail can be seen on film in extravagant clarity. The aspect ratio creates an almost square border to the action, emphasizing claustrophobia in every frame. Old's constant farting, cursing, sleeping, masturbating, etc. paint him as an old kook. Dafoe's impeccable performance of the elevated text as well as the striking black and white drive home how he possesses some sort of infinite wisdom, sneaking into the viewer's mind stealthily that he is more than meets the eye. As Young's realization of the horror that Old represents to him comes to fruition, we finally see what we have expected, that Old is a shapeshifter. A ghost of Proteus himself, the old man of the sea, who is subservient to Poseidon and aims to protect his eternal position as keeper of the light for all of eternity. It then makes sense why Old goes up to the light and presents his naked body to it, to soak up eternal life and to continue his post. There are two images that are key to solidifying Old as Proteus, those being the shape-shifting moment before Young dominates Old into behaving like a dog, and the frame with the naked Old beaming lighthouse light directly into Young's eyes, symbolically bringing his fate into reality. The masculine framing of nudity here is to demonstrate terrible power, an interesting parallel to the use of nudity to express the horror of vulnerability in the more feminine The Witch. As Young grapples with missing his old identity and lifestyle, we see imagery of mermaids as dangerous, terrifying, beautiful creatures capable of bringing both ecstasy and terrible pain. His every doubt in his decision to shed his landlubbing identity is filtered through his sexuality.
Oh boy. A rare, a bloody steak. If I had a steak, I would fuck it.
He fantasizes about having mermaid sex. He expresses a level of gratuitous satisfaction through the brutal strangling and thrashing of a seagull, almost like choking a chicken.
Into a bird.
He finds himself so starved of attention he nearly kisses his greatest adversary, and he sees the classic cosmic horror image of tentacles again and again. Using the claustrophobic aspect ratio, the tentacles in particular evoke a feeling that there is a force greater than humanity at large on display. Young's experience and fate is realized near the end of the film, once his hubris has led him to finally dominate Old physically and take it upon himself to approach the light. The Fresnel lens, the very head of the film's central phallic symbol, is provocative, mysterious, and dangerous to those uninitiated, as we learn. Jung's fate as a Promethean figure is realized when the Fresnel lens opens up for him. His face is brutally distorted as he laughs. He laughs in the face of the gods. Like how Prometheus brought fire to humanity and gifted them the power of technology, Jung has to overcome the imposter syndrome his boomer work supervisor projects onto him and pursue his own perceived destiny. He will fall victim to the gods anyway, because the gods are the gods and they're going to do what gods do, which is punish mortals that challenge them. His fate is the same as Prometheus's. He is chained to a rock, abandoned on this island, left to be pecked alive by birds, the seagulls that he was warned not to antagonize from the start. Through the masculine anxieties of finding work, keeping a reputation, the futility of industry, homosexual repression, and the self-imposed focus on being a perfect version of the individual's function to society, we see the chaotic balance between imposter syndrome and hubris that American laborers of the time, and maybe also our time, experienced. It is an irreverent experience that hits the audience over the head with a concept so distant from our own time that the fact that we find parallels between then and now is the truest horror. Robert Eggers considers himself primarily to be a historian and to be a lover of research before he considers himself a filmmaker. Despite this, he has demonstrated a masterful understanding of how to amplify the things we find most unsettling about ourselves through a brutal combination of period-accurate detail, psychologically compelling imagery, purposefully open-ended conclusions, and found dialogue. It is promising to see a director create two feature films back-to-back that complement one another so well. For his next cinematic endeavor, Eggers looks back to the 10th century in Iceland. There is a speculation that The Northman takes cues from Hamlet, being a revenge story about a man seeking revenge for his slain father. But knowing Eggers, there will probably be more than a few things up his sleeve that will horrify us in a totally unexpected way.
Goddamn fox! You goddamn fox!
It's of a merchant's daughter brought up in Callio. Hurrah, me other girl, to let me go. She took me in the parlor and said, won't you be me beau? Hurrah, me other girl, do let me go. Oh, do let me go, me girl, do let me go. Hurrah, me other girl, do let me go. All around the sofa, lads and was and did they go. Hurrah, me other girl, do